Would you please join with me in welcoming Dr. Mark Baldwin?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me along this evening, because, as you probably guessed, I quite like talking about the Enigma machine and things of that nature. That's what we're doing tonight, the story of Enigma. And as the chairman has said, this is an Enigma machine here. Many people say, gosh, I thought it was bigger than that, because it's rather small, but it has a huge significance. Don't worry about the physical size of it. It's the significance that is important. So, off we go. That's it, looking large, as you see. It's rather old-fashioned. It looks like, people often say, if they're elderly like me, they say it looks a bit like a portable typewriter. And indeed, it looks very like a portable typewriter because it has 3 rows of typewriter-like keys along the front there. You can see them in the picture there. Sometimes I talk to schools about these things, and I have to say and explain to them that a portable typewriter looks like an Enigma machine. Because, I mean, who of the young people amongst us, who of those would ever have seen or used or thought anything about a portable typewriter? However, it's always said to be roughly the size and shape of a portable typewriter, and that is what it reminds people of. The oak case that it's mounted in is another old-fashioned touch. So perhaps it's rather older than you might imagine. In fact, its history goes back a very long way before World War II. It's only, of course, of historical significance because of its role in the Second World War. But its origins go back far beyond that. And we're going to start off by looking at the history of the machine. Where did it come from? Why was it developed? And at the time that it was? Well, in one sense, that guy up in the top left-hand corner, Marconi, whose name you probably recognise, and you might guess if you didn't know that he was an Italian. He was a sort of a physics student in Italy in the 1890s. He had this crazy idea that you could make things happen at a distance merely by sending electromagnetic radiation through the air. He'd got this bee in his bonnet about that, and in Italy he was written off as a bit of a loony, and he wasn't a very good student. He came over to England and he was backed in the 1890s. He was backed by the government through the GPO, the General Post Office, because they were interested in communication of all forms in those days. So the government gave him money through the GPO, and he set about experimenting. And first of all, sending a message, if you like, a signal from one end of a room to another, then outside for 100 metres or so, then across from Hampshire to the Isle of Wight, then across the Irish Sea, and then finally, by 1901, he had proved all the sceptics were wrong. He was right because he sent a message right across the Atlantic. So a lot of people said, well, he might be all right, but when you get round to the curvature of the Earth, you won't be able to get round there, will you? You know, any more than you get light going round there. But he was right. You could even send messages round the curvature of the Earth. Now, he's not a military man, and he's not a mathematician, he's not a cryptographer. But he was saying to the world in 1901, look, world, I've got a brand new, high-speed, electrically based communication system that will allow people to communicate very quickly all the way around the world. Wonderful, wonderful invention. But you have to remember there was already something like that in existence. There was an electrically based high-speed communication system stretching around the world, which was using cables. The Victorians, the last 2 or 3 decades of the Victorian period, had seen effectively tens of millions of pounds put into laying tens of thousands of miles of copper conducting cables stretching all around the world, connecting together most of the major cities of the world, a great bundle of them going from UK to the east coast of America with about 12 or 15 separate cables going across, and all these were privately owned. So if you wanted to use them, you paid to have your message sent down the wire. And it travels at roughly the speed of light. So it was a brand new, the cable system, when it was implemented, was a brand new system and was earning very, very good money for the companies who'd put their capital into the cables. And you can imagine that people wanted to use it because before the cables, if you had wanted to send a message from, let's say, from London to Melbourne, Australia, and get an answer back, it would have to go by steamship. And you'd be talking about not days, but weeks just to send a message from England to Australia and get an answer back. Once you've got the cables in position, you can do that with a bit of luck, if everything's set up properly, in hours, not days or weeks. So obviously the cable system took a lot of traffic and earned a lot of money. So when Marconi comes onto the world and says, look, I can do everything the cable boys were doing, but I don't need the cables. That was his great selling point, which is why he called it wireless telegraphy, writing at a distance without the wires. And of course, every obstacle was put in his way, every possible obstacle was put in his way by the people who own the cables, because they could see their very nice income being eroded by his invention. So although he proved in 1901 that he was right, it was not taken up widely. Wireless was not taken up widely until we got into World War I. And this, as you see from 1915, this is an advert during the First World War saying the latest marvel of science applied to warfare is wireless fitted to fast motor cars. The military men realized what a brilliant way of communicating wireless was going to be. Because if you use wireless, even if sender and receiver are both moving around, they can remain in real-time contact without the need to be joined together by a wire, without the need to be able to see each other or hear each other, and without the need to write a message on a piece of paper and give it to man or dog or pigeon to carry from sender to receiver. All those techniques were being used at this time. But wireless allows you to escape from those very real limitations. But, as is so often the case, it comes at a price, and I don't mean a financial price, an operating price. There's an operating cost to using wireless, and that is, wireless provides you zero security. That's why mobile phones get hacked into, because when you're holding your mobile phone, however clever you are, the message cannot get into that big mast up on the hill without going by wireless. That's why people can hack into emails and other messages like that, even now. So you have to remember, wireless itself gives you zero security. So if the military men wanted to use wireless as a secret system, or a basis for a secret or secure system of communication, which of course is important, particularly important during the war, then they needed to do one more thing. They can't stop the enemy listening into every single message they send. They have to accept that. The only thing they can do is to make the messages difficult to understand. So before the message is sent, what you need to do is to disguise it in some way. To disguise it or scramble it, or here we come, encode it or encipher it, so that although you must accept the enemy can listen into every message you send, and you don't know whether the enemy does or not. You can't even tell whether it's been listened into. There's one coming in just now. Okay.
It's got to be me, isn't it? Am I trying to stop?
It's a nice tune, anyway. So, the adoption of wireless during World War I demonstrated the need for this other piece of equipment. A piece of equipment.
I can. Stop now.
All right, well done.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
It's all right, don't worry. Makes a point about the wireless. Yeah, thank you. A demonstration there in our midst. So what the use of wireless by the military men demonstrated was there was a need for an extra piece of equipment. A piece of equipment which could, in a speedy way, it's got to be quick, because just like with emails, because the messages travel quickly, people want to deal with them quickly. In the days you were sending a message by steamer and it was taking weeks to get to Australia and back, it didn't matter whether you took half a day to encipher it or encode it with some sort of famous complex system with pencil and paper and grids and things. But if it travels by wireless, because it goes fast, people want it dealt with fast. So you've got to have something that is fast but also sophisticated. It's no good using a very simple system, because the enemy will listen into that and break it. And so various inventors in different parts of the world started work on trying to invent a machine which could be used in conjunction with wireless, not instead of wireless, in conjunction with wireless, to provide the necessary secrecy. Various people in various countries working on that, but the first man to take out a patent on just such a machine was a man called Arthur Scherbius, and he was a German, and that is the date, 23rd of February 1918. That is the first patent which actually leads to the creation of the Enigma machine. So although it only comes to historical significance in World War II, you can see that its origins and the need for it were detected right back in World War I. Now, this Scherbius was a brilliant man. He had these brilliant ideas about how such a machine might be made. He hadn't actually got round to building the machine when he applied for the patent. But he wanted to put his mark on, his ownership mark. He wanted to make the ideas his intellectual property before he went on further and developed the machine. So that's what he did. He put the ideas into this patent. It hasn't got a drawing from which you could build a machine, but the principles which were going to govern the Enigma machine are in this patent of the 23rd of February, or patent application, 23rd of February 1918. Now, I say he was an unlucky man. He had a lot of patents to his name. In various fields. He was quite a prolific inventor and investor. And he went on after the war, after the war ended, he went on to develop his ideas into an actual working machine. And of course, he tried, as a loyal German, he tried to interest the German government in buying his invention. Why wouldn't you? And you might have thought that the German Navy and the German Foreign Office would surely be interested in providing secrecy for long-distance communications. Well, they might or might not have been, but they weren't going to pay anything for it. So there's the first stroke of bad luck. Scherbius cannot get the government to invest in his machine and buy it, guaranteed to buy it. He himself and his company had put a great deal of he'd put the emotional capital in and financial capital into this project. And the only way in 1922, 1923, the only way he could hope to get anything out of the project was by putting the machine on the market. This is the commercial brochure with which Arthur Scherbius's company, it was never called the Enigma Company, note. Enigma's there inside the lid, but it's a cipher machine company, the Chiffre Machine in Acting-Gesellschaft. And he produces this brochure to publicise his machine. And any of us here in this room, had we been alive 100 years ago, any ordinary person going into a big office supplier in Dortmund or Bremen or Bremerhaven or Hamburg or Berlin could have bought one of these over the counter. They were being sold alongside other office equipment like typewriters, pencil sharpeners, staplers and all that kind of thing. You could just buy one. There was no problem, no restriction. Second stroke of bad luck for poor old Scherbius is that although he put it on the market then, not enough people wanted to buy it at that particular time. This is the mid-1920s. He sold a few, including one to Britain. He sold a few of these machines, but not enough to finance the setting up of the production line in which these machines were being made. Third stroke of bad luck, and this is the final one, Arthur Scherbius is killed in an accident in 1928, and he must have gone to his grave a disappointed man when he looked back on the Enigma machine. Brilliant invention, brilliant ideas, absolutely groundbreaking, but nobody seemed to want to buy it. It ate up money rather than producing money for him. What he did not live long enough to see was that about that time, the late 1920s, there was a change of heart in Germany, because German activities were very, very curtailed by the Treaty of Versailles, which, as you know, formally ends World War I, signed in June 1919, and on terms, of course, and conditions that were very unfavourable to Germany as the loser and very favourable to the winning nations. And that restricted what Germany could do in terms of building up armed forces. And to start with, of course, they're wrestling with massive inflation immediately after the end of World War I. But once they got over that, the more, let's call them the more nationalist, the more right-wing end of the country wanted to break the law, because it was the law, the Treaty of Versailles was a law in Germany. They wanted to break the law and build up their armed forces as secretly as possible. So they wanted a secure communication system to underpin this rearmament that they were going to force through despite the provisions and conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. So they looked around for a secret communication system, and what, lo and behold, this is the best one on the market. And better than that, as far as the German government is concerned, it's leaderless because Arthur Scherbius has been killed in an accident and the company is financially weak. So it could not resist takeover by the German government. And then, of course, if you or I had gone back to buy a second machine in, say, 1929, to the same place we went to in Dortmund and bought one a few years ago and said, oh, I'd like some more of those machines, please. No. completely off the market. The whole of the output was reserved for the German government, and Scherbius did not live long enough to see that eventually, in the next 17 years, something like 35,000 of these machines will be bought. So success came, but not during Scherbius' lifetime, sadly for Scherbius himself. There it is. That's the same picture I showed before. Because we've now looked at the history, you're now going to understand how the machine works. And you might think, you might have come here thinking, you might have feared this is going to be terribly technically difficult. But take it from me, it's easy enough to understand where the machine, how the machine works, and how it can generate such a very large number of different cipher patterns. And that's its great skill, that's great virtue. So here we are, that's the same picture as before. We've got here a keyboard, looking and reminding people of a typewriter keyboard. And it's got, there are effectively typewriter keys. The technology is not watchmaking technology, it's at the level of accuracy of typewriters. So it's not surprising they look like typewriter keys. But this is your input section. That's your input section, and you can see, or at least the people with either with their field glasses or opera glasses or very good eyes can see that we've only got 26 uppercase letters there on those keys. There's no space bar, there's no punctuation, there's no numerals, and there's no shift key. So although it does look a bit like a typewriter, it's a very limited, stripped down typewriter. All you can put into an Enigma machine is one uppercase letter at a time. And the way it works is this: the person who wants to have a message encrypted before transmission, it could be transmitted on paper, but generally they would be transmitted by wireless. He presses the keys, spelling out the German words one letter at a time. I'm going to press key P, and it's lit up W. When you take your finger off the P key, the W goes out. And suppose I hadn't noticed that. Remember, the machine doesn't record. It doesn't transmit. It's not a transmitter. You will read bad accounts of the Enigma machine talking about Germans transmitting messages on Enigma machines. It's not a radio set. It's not a wireless. All it is a scrambling device. All it does is to change one letter into another. That's all. That's a correct description of an Enigma machine. All it does is to change one letter that you put in to another letter. I pressed a P, and it lit up the W bulb. That means that W is the cipher version, the substituted version, the disguised version of P at that moment. But if your finger slipped off before you were quite sure whether you lit up P, I pressed P here, whoops, and it lit up W. You might say, well, was it a Q or a W? I'm not quite sure. I mean, this may be used in a battlefield, a shell might have gone off, you're not quite sure which one it was. You might think of press P again and see what happens. Press P again, we got a Y. Press P again a third time, we've got an X. Press it a fourth time, I've got a Z. Press it a fifth time, I've got a V. I've pressed the same key 5 times, and I've got 5 different outputs. So this means it's not making a simple cipher. It's not just changing every A into F and every B into Z and every C into Q. That would be a cipher, but it would be such a simple cipher that anyone in their first day or two at cipher school would be able to break a message like that. So it's got to do something more complicated, and it does that. It changes one letter into another, that's all it does, but the pattern it uses is changing all the time. And it achieves that by having up here, you can't see, but there are 3 rotors there. This is the standard machine which all the German armed forces were using, not on the day that war started. They wasn't on the shelf waiting for war to start. They had been using it. The Air Force, the Army, and the Navy had been using this machine for getting on for 10 years before the start of World War II. And therefore, they were well versed in its use. So their standard machine has 3 rotors in. And indeed, not only did the armed forces use it, but also a lot of other government departments like the post office, secret police, the railways, they all used this. Germany believed this was a good machine, so everybody used it for his formal official stuff. So we haven't got anything that looks like a rotor there, because all you can see is 3 vertical lines, which are the edges of 3 notched flanges, one attached to each rotor. They're called rotors because they go round, which is quite a good reason for calling them rotors. And what happens when the operator presses a key, when I press the key, you won't be able to see it from where you are, so come and have a look afterwards. Every time you press a key, not only does one of those little bulbs light up, but at least one rotor turns round. And the significance of that is that the wiring through which the current must flow from the key to the bulb, it has to go through the rotors. And the rotors have wiring inside, which means that when they turn round, they are changing the pattern of wiring in the machine. That's why when I pressed the same key 5 times, it gave me 5 different letters out. And so that the sophistication of the machine largely depends on the rotors and the fact they have wiring inside and they go round during the operation. So this is it's a cipher machine because it creates a substitution cipher. It only substitutes one letter for another. And that's a simplest sort of substitution cipher you can imagine in terms of writing it down. But it's a rotor cipher machine because it depends on these rotors for a great deal of its cryptographic power. And because the rotors, the rotational position of the rotors makes a difference, that's why when it turns around you get a different letter out when you press the same key, the operator must need to know what position they're in at any one moment. And those three little white squares are holes cut through that inner metal lid through which the operator can see, depending on the exact model, he'll either see a number from 1 to 26 or a letter of the alphabet A to Z. And that tells him what rotational position the rotor is in. And that means he can set the rotors, before he starts to use the machine, he can set the rotors in particular positions just by pulling on those notch flanges, and he can check he's got the desired position by looking through those three little windows to see that he's set it at what he's meant to set it at before he starts the encryption procedure. So we have got here keyboard for input, 26 uppercase letters. We've got the lamp board for output. Underneath each of these letters, there is a little bulb, just a unique bulb, one under each of the bulbs. When you press a key, one of these bulbs lights up. As I say, do come and play with it at the end if you wish. You'll probably, no, you won't be able to see it well enough from there. So keyboard for input, lamp board for output, rotors which contain the wiring linking the input section to the output section and through which the current must flow. They go round during the operation and their position is revealed by what you can see through those three little windows there. And down the bottom, to which I'll return later, there is what we call the plug board. Now, ciphers. Nowadays, children do all sorts of coding work at schools, and so they should. But most of us, I think, probably went through the whole of our educational system without looking at ciphers. Some of you may have done. But let me just show you something, or either remind you or reveal to you something, or explain something about ciphers. There is a message there which has been enciphered using a substitution cipher. And you might look at that and think, well, how on earth could I work out what that means? Well, you could, if you looked at it with your code-breaking eye, and remember that code breaking requires a lot of trial and error. You try something, you try the simplest thing you can think of. If it works, fine. If it doesn't work, throw it away and start again. So the first thing you do, if you look at it with your code-breaker's eye, is to say it looks, does it not, as though the word lengths are still there. It looks as though the spaces are probably the spaces between the words in the original message. So we've got a 4-letter group, we've got a 2-letter group, a 1-letter group. Now, there aren't many 1-letter words in English. Not many. Of course, it could be a message to go to P store or something like that, or P ground or something like that. So it could be an odd letter on its own, but the simplest thing to assume is that it's a word in the English language with 1 letter in. And the nearest one to B is A. Well, try it, see what happens. Maybe to turn this message back into the original plain text English, we step 1 letter back up the alphabet. So if we go back 1 up the alphabet from I, we get H, and 1 up the alphabet from F, E, and then S. You've done it. Simple. You've broken it, even though when it came up on the screen, you might have thought it was too difficult to break. So that's it. Here is a secret message. It's enciphered by a technique that was known to Julius Caesar. You just step down the alphabet a certain specified number. I did it 1 because that's the simplest thing to look at. So where H turned into I, E turned to F, R was enciphered to S, E enciphered, etc., to F. Now that's very simple, and if this machine had done only that, then, as I say, it would not have been sophisticated enough to provide any secrecy at all. But that's 2,000 years ago. And techniques were understood and developed for breaking such messages many centuries ago. But if we type those 20 letters into an Enigma machine, we might get that out. And if you choose then to send it disguising the word lengths. In other words, you just divide the whole thing up and send it in blocks of 5. So we've got 5 space 5 space 5 space 5, thus disguising completely the length of the original words. Then it's going to be unbreakable. It's too short. If it's an Enigma message, it's too short for even Alan Turing himself to be able to break, because it's too short to get to grips with, because it's a very complicated system. And any system in which you disguise the length of the words, you're then making it more difficult for your enemy, whoever that might be. It might be the police, it might be a foreign country, it might be an enemy, army or whatever. If you disguise the word length, it's going to be more difficult for the enemy to understand than if the word length is revealed. Because remember, we focused on this B, and had that B just been, if it was just IFSFJ, TBTFD, we wouldn't have identified that B as being a single word on its own. So any message, any system in which you disguise the word length, you make it more complicated. And of course, there's no space bar, remember, on the Enigma machine. The spaces are put in by the man with a Morse code key who taps out the dots and dashes of the outgoing message. And he is told, if he's doing a German message, he is told to divide it up into blocks of 5. And so it's 5 letters a space, 5 letters a space, 5 letters a space. So no clue about the length of the words there at all. That is the way the Germans did it. So that's just the same one as before. To remind you, keyboard for input, 26 uppercase letters. Lamp board for output, 26 little bulbs under there. Rotors, which have the wiring linking this bit to this bit, input to output, and then their rotational position is identified by looking through those 3 little windows. If we open that inner metal lid and look at underneath that, we can see now very readily the 3 rotors. Here they are. They've got 3 notched flanges because there's 3 rotors, 1 notched flange attached to each of those. There are 3 lettered index rings, 1 attached to each of the rotors. And those 3 moving rotors, they actually turn round. All of these rotors can be turned round. I'm turning round by hand, all of them there. Again, you can come and do this at the end. You're very welcome. They're sandwiched between these 2 shiny cylindrical bits, 1 at each end. This one, called the entry rotor, it doesn't actually rotate, but it is so closely associated with the rotors that both in German and in English it's called rotor. This is the entry rotor, and at the other end, cramped up against there to hold the whole thing tightly together, is what's called the reflector rotor. Again, it doesn't rotate, but both in German and English it's called a rotor, a Walzer in German, a wheel. So those 2 stationary bits clamp it together. When the operator presses a key, a modest current, there's a little tiny battery in there, a modest current runs through, it comes into the entry rotor and it enters the right-hand face of the right-hand rotor. And I told you, inside the rotor there's wiring. And that, I must admit, I think that puts some people off, because it begins to look rather complicated, doesn't it? It looks like something very untidy, and how could you possibly understand what's going on in there? It only looks complicated because of the physical difficulty with a human-sized finger and thumb and soldering iron of soldering the wires into the rotor and then squashing the whole thing down, because it's got to be fit into that gap there. This has been taken out there to show you what's inside. So it's not complicated in principle. So that's the wiring inside there. So it comes in, the current will come in here at some particular point, and it will be deflected by the wiring. It might come in here and go out of the left-hand side of the right-hand rotor there, and thus enter the right-hand face of the middle rotor, which will deflect it again, perhaps down to here, and it goes into the left-hand rotor and deflected to here, into the reflector rotor, which turns it round and sends it back through the rotors on what is inevitably a different zigzag path. It cannot go back on the same path. So it comes in here, going up here, zigzags through there, turn round, zigzags on a different path, goes out through the entry rotor and down to the body of the machine and lights up one of the bulbs. You can see some of the bulbs here. There's a number of those little bulbs. They look just like small torch battery bulbs, and they're about the same voltage. They only require about 4 volts to run. So there's the scrambler unit, which is at the core, not the heart, not the brain, but at the core of all Enigma machines. Given that there were over 30,000 made for different end users, not surprisingly, there were some variations, different models and so on. But they all have something like that at their core. And then finally, there is something which does actually look like a rotor. That's one of the rotors, or 2 in fact, taken out of the machine and photographed. And this left-hand side of the screen shows you the left-hand face of the rotor. And that's got a ring of 26 little little flat brass contact studs flush with the face of the rotor. And if we flip the rotor over and look on the other side, this side, on the right-hand side, we can see here 26 little sprung brass pins sticking out of the face of the rotor, sticking out towards you, and looking very much like what you see if you look into a bayonet bulb socket, except they're smaller than that, a bit smaller. And you'll sense, I think, that if I were to take those two rotors and press them together, it's the sprung brass pins on one coming up against the studs on its neighbour, which allow two essential things to happen. I can turn any one rotor round ad infinitum. I'm not going to do it ad infinitum, but I'll show you. It's no restriction on that, because when you turn it round, the pins, the studs and the wiring go round in one lump. So nothing is getting twisted. There's no limit to how much turning you can do. Infinite rotation is possible, and when the rotor has stopped rotating, there's always a set of pins on one rotor in contact with the studs on its neighbour, allowing the current to flow. So those two things are necessary. Infinite rotation and electrical connectivity, those two things are essential for the Enigma machine, and it's this pin and stud system which makes it happen. And inside there, as I showed you, are those mesh, or mesh, shall we call it, that mass of green wirings inside there. And this is where I want to show you how conceptually simple it is. Imagine yourself as an apprentice in the shifter machine in Acton Gesellschaft trainee school, and you've got in front of you, it's your first day there, you know you've proved you can do some soldering, you're sitting at your workbench, and I'm the boss, and I said, look, here's an opened up rotor, here's a little box with 26 bits of green wire in there, and I want you to solder those wires into the rotor. And what you've got to do is to solder one piece of wire to each of the studs on one side, and the other end of the wire goes onto one of the pins. When you have finished, every wire will go from one side of the rotor to the other, and every pin will have one and only one wire attached, and every stud will have one wire and only one wire attached. You eagerly pick up your soldering iron and you start. Okay, I'm going to solder the first end of wire onto stud A. I'm going to put the other end onto pin F. Pick up the next one. I'm going to put that one on stud B and solder the other end onto J. And then you say, hang on. If I just follow my nose like that, I'm going to end up fulfilling the boss's basic requirement, but with a different wiring pattern from everybody else in the room. Because there are quite a lot of different ways, aren't there, that you can arrange the wires. If all you need to do is to solder each wire joining a pin on one side to a stud on the other. Anyone like to guess how many ways there might be? Hundreds? Thousands? Millions? 400 million. Wow. And if you don't believe me, you can multiply this string of things. Every number from 26 to 1, it gives you about 4. It happens to be, by convenience, it happens to be 26 zeros. If we had a 27-letter alphabet, there wouldn't be 27 here. It's just one of those mathematical coincidences that it's 4 times 10 to the 26. So that's the number of ways. If you imagine yourself in the factory or in the German cipher bureau, issuing Enigma machines, potentially you've got, as it were, in the cupboard behind you, you've got 400 million different wiring patterns you could use. And this, I hope, this gives you some sense of where the cryptographic power of the system must come from. Because remember, there are 3 rotors in the machine, so there's 3 of these together. It's not 3 times that number. It's 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. Followed by 78 zeros. And we haven't finished yet. We are building up a very large number to describe the variability of the Enigma machine. And of course, this is where its strength lies, and this is where the Germans were confident in its use. Now, let's just add the plug board in. The front of this old-fashioned box folds down, as I've folded this one down here. This little oak flap comes down, and you can see there's a vertical board there. We're looking horizontally in that view on the screen. There's a vertical board called in German Steckerbrett, called in Bletchley Stecker board, and in English it would be a plug board. It's got 26, you probably guessed that, 26 paired sockets and a number of 2-pin plugs joined together by a 2-core cable. And the way it works is this. If I were to take this plug, which is just lying down here, waiting to be used, and plug it into that pair of sockets labelled V, and that one, and put it into the pair of sockets labelled F. If I plug F to V, then every time the machine would have lit up the V bulb during operation, it will now instead light up the F bulb. And every time it would have lit up the F bulb, it will instead light up the V bulb. So it takes the output of the scrambler, and remember we're looking at 64 followed by 78 zeros for the scrambler, it takes the output of the scrambler and adds an extra layer of encryption, because we can now switch some of the letters in pairs in the output of the scrambler unit. And the machine will work equally well with no plugs at all. It doesn't have to have plugs on the board. It'll still work perfectly well. Or with no pairs, 1 pair, 2 pairs, 3 pairs, up to 13 pairs. And there are roughly 500 million ways in which you can put anything from no pairs to 13 pairs of plugs on the face of the board. And each one gives a different identity to the cipher pattern the machine is creating at that particular moment. Now, if I'd just given you 500 million, you might say, well, it's quite a big number. It's going to be difficult to sort anything out with 500 million. But I've told you already, and I hope you remembered, that a single rotor is worth 400 million. So a single rotor is much more variable than this plug board. So why, you might think, why fiddle about with this thing? Extra bits and pieces, complications, plugs. Why bother? The reason the German military added this to the commercial design they took over was to provide changeability. You could not have guys in the field, this is a field machine, you couldn't have guys in the field prizing open the rotors and resoldering the connections into a different pattern. But you can you not, pull the plugs out and put them back in somewhere else. People often come and they're very tempted to pull the plugs out. I mean, they will come out, but they're made to come out and go back in some other place. So what they did, what the German military did, was to put this on the front and then every single night at midnight, every single Enigma machine throughout the whole of the German armed forces had its wiring reconfigured by, amongst other things, moving the plugs around. It's left up to the individual operator to move the plugs physically from one position to another. It's not left up to him to decide into which position they should go at 12:15 in the morning or whatever it is, at midnight. It's not left up to him to do that. He must follow written instructions. He's got a book which tells him what to do every single night. It's different. It tells him what to do every single night. And the book only lasts for 1 month, so that if it's captured, it doesn't jeopardize the security of the system for more than 31 days, and obviously less than generally. So this plug provides variability. Now, at Bletchley Park, this is a horrific discovery or horrific result, because you might think it was jolly difficult for the guys at Bletchley, and when I say guys, there were 3/4 of them were women, let me say. You might think it would be difficult for the people at Bletchley Park to work out how to break Enigma. And breaking Enigma means working out the setting that has been used for a particular message or German messages by the German senders. That's what breaking Enigma requires. So you might think it'd be a very difficult thing to do, and indeed it would be a difficult thing to do. But it's worse than that, isn't it? Because not only have they got to break Enigma today, they've got to break it tomorrow and the day after and the day after and the day after. Because at midnight, the basic wiring inside every single Enigma machine changes. So the cipher pattern that Panzer Group 52's radio operator is producing today on his machine is not going to be the same tomorrow. You may break today's message sent by Panzer Group 52, but there's no guarantee you'll break tomorrow's, because he's reset everything in his machine at midnight. So this has a great impact on the work at Bletchley. Instead of breaking Enigma once, and sometimes the rather badly written books suggest that there are all these Oxbridge dons sitting around in armchairs thinking about Egyptian hieroglyphics and Greek and music and chess, chewing pencils, and saying, oh, how can we break this Enigma? And something happened. Something broke through. Alan Turing appeared, or somebody captured a machine, or somebody invented a computer. And then they said, right, that's wonderful, we can break all the messages. It was not like that at all, because every single night they had to go back to square one, almost to square one, and try to break Enigma again. And if that sounds difficult, which it would have been, and indeed it would, it's worse than that, because the German communication system, the wireless communication system, was subdivided into 30 or 40 different subnetworks. Every single one of those, every single Enigma machine was reconfigured every single night at midnight, but each of the 30 or 40 different subnetworks had a different configuration pattern. So the problem at Bletchley, if I say expressed simply, that's not fair. The problem at Bletchley is not breaking Enigma once, it's not breaking Enigma once a day, it's trying to break it 30 or 40 times a day. And not surprisingly, we did not break every single message we intercepted. No problem with interception. There is no security attached to wireless. If you stick up an aerial and you've got the right tunable receiver, you will hear every single message that's sent. And they're all jumbled up together, of course, because there'll be so many of them. But there's no real difficulty in picking up the messages. The difficulty is working out the setting of the machine, which has been used to generate one particular or message or a group of messages. And the plug board is part of the way that the system was made very much more complicated than you might at first think. Right, look at that. I told you we were building up to quite a large number. Just enjoy that. It's about the largest number that you are likely to come across, which has a real meaning in real terms. And the reason, we can all think of a bigger number, can't we? If 3 times 10 to the 114 is a big number, then 4 times 10 to the 114 is bigger, no problem. Or indeed 3 times 10 to the 115. So it's not a challenge to find a bigger number. It's a challenge to find something that actually represents in the universe in which we live. And the reason I say that is if you ask astronomers how many atoms do they believe, calculate, hypothesize, there are in the whole of the observable universe, not our solar system, not our galaxy, but the whole universe observable from Earth, they will tell you about 10 to the 80. And we've got 10 to the 114. So this little machine here, 100 years old, it's portable. You can carry it around in one hand. It has a modest power requirement, a little battery inside there. It gives you not just more cipher patterns than there are atoms in the observable universe, but millions of times more, because we've got here on the screen, we've got 10 to the 114 zeros, whereas the number of atoms is only got, special use of the word only, has only got 80 zeros on it. So, not surprisingly, anyone using that system, you would probably think they would be totally confident that the ciphers that created by this machine, the whole system, would be unbreakable because it's such a large number. And indeed, that's what the Germans thought. They said, and this will surprise you, they said perhaps the British will guess we are using a 3-rotor cipher machine. Now, you might think that's a pretty wild guess, but I haven't told you yet, and I'm telling you now, the Enigma machine was patented in Britain by its German makers in the 1920s. At the time, they were trying to sell, Arthur Scherbius and his company were trying to sell to anybody who would buy. They wanted to protect their intellectual property, and so it was patented in various countries, including Britain. 2 patents, in fact, were taken out on details of the Enigma machine. So it wasn't such a wild guess for the Germans to say the British might guess, and that wasn't such a wild guess, that we, the Germans, are using a 3-rotor cipher machine. But the German Cipher Bureau said the British won't know what the wiring pattern inside each rotor is. And there are 400 million ways they could have been wired. So the Germans said, let's suppose, we didn't do this, don't get me wrong, the Germans said, let's suppose the British build a huge test rig in which they can change each wiring link to go through 3 times 10 to the 114 possibilities to see which arrangement of wires in this test rig could turn an intercepted German message back into the original German. And remember, they have to accept we might intercept every message they ever send, because wireless gives no security at all. The Germans said, even if the British tried to build a test rig to do that, the war would have finished long before the first test is run. And that is true. With the technology available in the 30s and 40s, it was absolutely impossible to get anywhere near breaking Enigma by trying every possibility one after the other. That analysis was 100% correct. German Cipher Bureau, 100% correct. What the mistake they made was not in the analysis, but the conclusion they drew. They said, because you can't break Enigma by trying every possibility one after the other, therefore it will be unbreakable. And that is where they were wrong. Now, just as an aside, the big numbers are impressive. I agree, they're very impressive. I think they're impressive. And I think they're impressive to think that somebody generated a machine like that, thought it up 100 years ago. But, does anyone here, I'm not going to put anyone to the test. Does anyone here do code words? Anyone like to admit to do code words? I do. Anyone? Nobody else? No one else? Oh, yes, one. Okay. Well, those of you who do code words, put your hands up, very good. Those of you who don't, this is a code word, and you get it in the newspaper. It looks like a crossword grid, but it has a number in every single square. All the numbers from 1 to 26 are used. This is the convention. And you have to, each number is uniquely related to, it's not like the Enigma machine, each number is uniquely related to a letter. You're given a couple to start, or 3 actually to start off. You're told that all the 6s represent I, all the 13s represent L, and all the 26s represent M. Now that means there are actually 30,000 million possibilities left. Now, suppose I were to cut one of those out of the newspaper and put it in an envelope and say to you, or indeed if somebody came and said it to me, inside this envelope there is a problem, and there are 30,000 million possible solutions, only one of which is right. Do you think you could solve it? And look like that, you say, no, how can I possibly do anything like that? You need a professional mathematician or computer or something. How can I do that? I open the envelope up. It's a code word. Oh, no problem. Give us a cup of coffee and do it in 10 minutes. Why? Because you don't try 30,000 million possibilities one after the other. You bring extra information to bear. You know things about the English language. You know, for instance, one of the things you're always understood, that any Q there will be followed by U. No letter, no word will end in a Q. They're sort of fairly conventional, these things. You know that there are a lot of letters which are much more common at the ends of words than at the beginning. There are some letters which can occur doubled in a word and some which can't. There are not many letters which can be double in English, double at the beginning of a word. So you bring all these extra crumbs of information to bear. You've got to do a little bit of trial and error, but in 10 or 15 minutes you will be able to solve that. Now, that doesn't mean, even though it has this huge number. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that if you could solve code word, you'd be good at Bletchley Park. You might well be. You might have the right kind of mind to do it. But it does mean that one's got to be a little bit careful about taking very large numbers and thinking that it will be impossible for an ordinary person to solve a problem like that. Because with code word, you can solve it. No, actually, no difficulty at all. But the thing that was very strange was not so much that the Germans just assumed that because the Enigma machine could generate a large number of possibilities, and therefore it would be unbreakable by the British. What they do not seem to have stopped to think about is maybe mathematicians would be its undoing. Because most of us, faced with a problem with lots of big numbers in, would think this is a mathematician's job. And Germany's produced a lot of fine mathematicians over centuries. So it's very surprising they didn't stop to do this. But it's not surprising that the three guys who broke Enigma first were mathematicians. Polish mathematicians who'd been on a crash course of cryptography at Poznan University because Poland realized that great chunks of territory which was ceded to them under the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919, they were delighted, the Poles, but they realized that Poland was too weak to keep out an invading German army if Germany wanted to take them back. So they thought they'd better monitor German communications so that they would know what was happening. Not because the weaker party can use intelligence to defeat the stronger, but the weaker party can use intelligence to minimize the damage which the stronger might otherwise inflict upon them. And that's the situation in Poland. So the Poles were monitoring German wireless traffic once they sensed this rearmament taking place at the end of the 1920s. And they realized, by listening to the radio, their intercepting radios, sticking up their aerials, they could break the first messages quite easily because the Germans were using simple methods to encipher their messages. And then something went wrong, or not went wrong for the Poles. All they could hear was a long string of Morse code letters with no apparent sense or meaning to them. And that's when Germany had adopted the Enigma machine. So these three guys were the top of the class of a crash course in cryptography at Poznan University, run by the Polish Cipher Bureau. And this is Riewski here, this is Ruzicki in the middle, and Jigalski here. They were the guys who were top of the class, and their reward was to be given a commercial Enigma machine, which didn't have the plug board on and didn't have the same wiring inside as the military ones, and told that they'd got to work out how to break it. And they did it by 1932, long before the war started. Those three Poles brought intelligence to bear. They had plenty of raw material. Stick up the aerials, you'll hear the messages. They had plenty of raw material. They used some high-powered mathematics and imagination and a lot of hard work, and they worked out how Enigma might be broken. And we must admire them for that, because intellectually that is a tremendous achievement, which anyone who knew about Enigma would have thought was impossible. But the Poles did it. So admire them for their intellectual prowess in breaking Enigma, the first people ever to do that. Also, remember, if you're on the Allied side, remember that we owe them a great debt of gratitude, because before the war started, they gave to the British and the French, their two allies, everything they knew about the Enigma machine and how its ciphers might be broken before the start of World War II. And had they not done that, then the work at Bletchley Park would not have got off to the flying start that it did. There's a much repeated photograph. I think it's the colouring. I think is post-war colouring. They were black and white photographs taken of General Guderian, one of the great Panzer generals, one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, and he's with his communication unit. And there he is. He's got his right hand on the radio set, just about portable radio set. Here's a radio man, and you can see he's got the headphones on. He's got the headphones to listen to incoming messages, and he'll have a Morse code key to tap out the dots and dashes of the outgoing messages. If he's got an Enigma message coming in, he will write it down. It doesn't mean anything to him at all. He can't get anything in context because all it is a long string of Morse code letters in blocks of 5, and that doesn't mean anything. If he mishears a P for a Z or whatever, he can't put that right himself. There's no way he can do it. So he writes down what he can hear, and when he's got the whole lot, he gives it to these two guys who are going to operate the Enigma machine here. Provided they have their machine set up identically to the machine that the sender has used when the sender starts to encrypt the message, provided the receiver's machine sets up to match that exactly, then what the sender types in is plain German. What the sender gets out is a long string of Morse code letters. What the receiver gets coming through these headphones is a long string of Morse code letters. And if these guys type in that long string of Morse code letters into the receiver's Enigma machine, the machine itself will automatically turn it back into German. It acts what we call reciprocally. And that's the way the Germans use the machine, and it's the way in which the cleverness resided in the machine. These guys didn't have to have degrees in maths or anything like that. They had to have absolute minimal qualifications. They had to be able to read and write. They had to have some sort of clue about what a current was and a battery and a bulb. They didn't have to know anything about number theory, cryptography, linguistics, computing, anything like that at all. They just had to do their job letter perfect. And as long as they're punctilious and do everything letter perfect, the machine will do all the cleverness that's required. It will encipher and disguise, therefore, the message at the sender's end and reverse the procedure automatically at the receiver's end. So that's the machine looked at from the German side. You can see, I hope now, where it came from, how you've got some sense of how it generates these very large number of possible different cipher patterns, and why the Germans had every confidence in it. This is Bletchley Park. This is the British code-breaking centre during World War II. Virtually all the major code-breaking was done there, but there were outstations elsewhere. 1938 is not the date that it was built. It's the date that it was bought, because the intelligence and code-breaking people were looking ahead, and they feared a year or two before the war that war might be coming. That was the feeling in the air. Now, their code-breaking is being done in London. And what people feared in the middle of the last century was that if there was to be major warfare, in Europe particularly, then it would be accompanied by major bombing of the cities. So don't wait until your code-breaking centre gets bombed in London. Find somewhere before the war as a safe place for the code breakers to work, a war station. And this was bought in 1938 to be the code breakers' war station. It was bought more than 12 months before the start of the war. It's a memorable building for all the wrong reasons. It's about the worst bit of architecture you could ever hope to see everywhere, which does make it memorable. And it doesn't look anything like a code-breaking centre. It was in the right place, accessible from London, but not close enough to London to be bombed during bombing raids and so on. Well served by major communication systems, because it lies pretty well on the line, a physical line between London and Birmingham. So it's got well served by railway, by road, and by telephones, which are terribly important at Bletchley Park. So well situated on the market, and it was bought, and it provided not only, there's the mansion, there it is, it's bigger than the house, the sort of houses in which most of us live, but although there were, at the beginning of the war, there were 100 and something people, and nobody lived on site, by the way. It's a working site, not accommodation. They're all billeted elsewhere. But even before the war started, these far-sighted code-breaking and intelligence people said, we are probably going to need more people working here than we can provide office space for in the mansion. There's the mansion. That's the photograph I've just shown you, taken in the direction of that arrow there. So even before the war started, a series of one-storey huts were built in adjacent to the mansion. That's hut number 4, that's hut number 8, that's hut number 6, that's hut number 3, that's hut number 1. But the first 5 of those huts, labelled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, good sort of military style, were built before the war started to provide office accommodation for the people who were going to come. And of course, the numbers went on building up and up and up. 140 at the beginning of the war, 9,000 by 1944. So they needed all these buildings here. These are all built during the war. These are 2- and 3-story brick and concrete buildings, rather more robust than the huts that we got here to start with. So on that site, if you'd gone there any time, day or night, from the middle of 1944 onwards, there would have been, they worked 3 8-hour shifts, of course, there would have been about 3,000 people working on that site. But they didn't live there. So every 8 hours, you've got to get 3,000 people on the site and 3,000 people on the off the site. Obviously, this was noticed by the local people. You can't move thousands of people several times a day without actually coming to the attention of other people. But while they're on the on site, they've got to be fed too. If they're there for 8 hours a day, they've got to have a meal. So there's a major logistics operation underpinning this amazing code-breaking operation going on at Bletchley Park. And most of those Second World War buildings are still there. This one had a building on, but that was demolished. But all these things still stand here. Some of the wooden huts and virtually all the brick and concrete buildings still there. So if you go there now,
10 minutes.
right, if you go there now, you get some sense of what it was like all those years ago. What did they do at Bletchley? If you ask somebody that, they say they broke Enigma. Yes, they did, but it's not the end in itself. If you think about what they're doing and why they're doing it, they're trying to win the war, which means it's part of a much bigger process, which is to provide information to our guys in the field and give them the edge over the enemy. So Bletchley, breaking the Enigma and breaking other messages, is a part of a multi-stage process. First of all, you've got to intercept the messages done in Y stations, wireless intercept stations. The nearest one to here, I think, would be Whitchurch. The old vicarage, the old rectory in Whitchurch had the basement full of people listening 24 hours a day, people down there listening to wireless messages and then sending them down to Bletchley Park. They got by one means or another. What the code breakers had to do, as I've hinted, is to find the Enigma settings. They knew what the machine was like, but they don't know how the machine's been set up for a particular message. If they can do that, they can then decipher the message, they can reverse the encipherment, then they need to translate it, and then they were breaking 3,000 messages a day at Bletchley Park. You can't send all those to somebody. You've got to sift through, intelligence people have to sift through and try to find some little clues which will give our guys in the field the edge over the enemy in the battles that are to come. That gives you an idea of the people there. I told you about 100 and something at the beginning of the war, and by the time we get to mid-1944, we're looking at that 9,000 up here. And this paler blue band, we didn't put all the equipment that we were using in Bletchley Park in case it were bombed. It was subdivided and put into annexes attached to country houses in the vicinity. And in those outstations, there are about 2,000 people there. So altogether, you've got well over 10,000 people involved. And most of them, as I stressed before, most of them were women. Something like 3/4 of the people there were women. And that room shows, that's a wartime photograph, sorry, we're going backwards. It's a wartime photograph inside one of the blocks, not one of the huts, uncaptioned photograph as it happens. The problem Bletchley have is that they can hear the messages, but if you only know the messages, if you only pick up the intercepts, you can't make any progress at all. There are 3 separate sets of information. This is the simplest way to look at the Enigma. 3 separate sets of information. The plain text, which is the German message an officer wants to send. The settings, which come out of the little red book that's got to be applied to every night at midnight to get the new settings for the new day. And then if you type in the plain German with the right settings, out come, 1 letter at a time, on the sender's machine, the ciphertext, which is then sent by Morse code to the receiver. The receiver must have a copy of the same red book. So he's got the Enigma settings of the book, he's got the ciphertext, and if you know any 2 of those, you can regenerate the 3rd. And that's the way the Enigma system worked for the Germans. Bletchley's problem is they only know the ciphertext. That they can get by sticking up the aerial. So what they have to do is to guess. They have to guess, hypothesize that a bit of a message actually contains a particular German word or phrase. They can test their guess in a giant machine, and then if the guess is right, they've got a bit of plain text, correctly guessed, they've got the ciphertext, and if you know any 2 of those, you can work out the other one, and that's the Enigma settings. And that enables to break one message or one group of messages for one day. But it all changes every single day at midnight. And that's the machine they used. A giant machine called the bomb. It doesn't explode. It's not electronic, and it's not a computer, and it does not break Enigma. But the guys on night shift must look at the incoming messages and must guess, make an informed guess. It's not just a shot in the dark. An informed guess that a particular string of letters in that text on the table represents a German word or phrase. And they can plug the guess in at the back, press the button, and then set the machine going. And you'll see it's got sets of 3 discs made in England. They're not captured Enigma rotors, but they're rotors. And inside the rotors are 2 sets of 26 terminals wired together in exactly the same way that we knew was inside the German Enigma machines, because the Poles worked it out and told us what it was before the war started. So each one is a trial Enigma machine. And there's 36 on the front of that. And what this machine is doing is turning them around, sending currents through, and looking for something that matches what your guess with the, you've guessed a bit of plain text with the cipher text. And it's looking for a match. It doesn't necessarily find it. It may run through all the possibilities and say, no, you're wrong. You've got to go back to square one. It can only test 600,000 possibilities. That's not enough, because you remember the basic thing, we've got 3 times 10 to the 114. You can't test all those. But with a bit of luck, with a bit of knowledge coming in, the wiring in the rotors, you can narrow it down, and with a bit of luck, when that machine runs through 600,000 possibilities, one of them it will identify as being the right setting. That's the man who invented it. That's Alan Turing. You probably have lots of these. He's on the £50 note. You remember that was following the great television, a series of polls to try and find the greatest Briton of the 20th century. And if we look at the effect of this, this is Allied merchant shipping losses in thousand tons, not in numbers of ships sunk, but in the capacity of the ships sunk. That's 900,000 tons, nearly 1 million tons in a month. And we've got this very strange shape of losses. These are the red bars, are the losses in the North Atlantic. A very strange shape indeed. But this explains what was going on. From here to here, we could not break naval 3-rotor Enigma, but the Germans were breaking a lot of our messages with which we were organising the convoys. Then we captured material from that U-boat and other German naval units, and that enabled us to break the messages, so we knew where the U-boats were going to lie in wait, and we could steer the convoys round. The losses come whizzing down, and then something disastrous happens at the end of 41 and into 42. December 41, Pearl Harbor brings another player into the North Atlantic. And December 42, a 4th rotor was put into the machine. Instead of a basic 3-rotor machine, a 4th rotor was put into the machines which only the U-boats were using. So it's multiplying the power of the cipher by 400 million, and we couldn't break them. We can hear the messages, no problem, but we don't know how to break it until nearly the end of the war, when we board U-boat U-559 in the eastern Mediterranean. Its depth charge comes blasted to the surface. It's boarded by 2 guys off a Corvette, and then they get not the machine, but they get the paperwork. The paperwork doesn't look so dramatic, but it's the paperwork which is the important thing to capture, because by and large we know what the machine is like, but it's the instructions that go with it which are important. And so we got a graph there which fits very nicely with what's going on at Bletchley. From here to here we can't break Enigma, from here to here we can, from here to here we can't, and from here we can. And there's such a strong correlation that it's not proof, I grant that, but I'm absolutely persuaded that the work done at Bletchley Park made a difference to the way the war was fought and eventually won. And don't believe me, believe Churchill how important the Battle of the Atlantic was. Everything depended on its outcome. For the whole of the war, we needed to import, it has to come by sea, the food and raw materials we need. And before the war, we were importing something like 30 million tons a year, and that's still got to come in to keep us going. The second half of the war, we're also, as well as the 30 million tons, we're bringing in hundreds, thousands of American servicemen and women, and the equipment that they need to build up a giant army so that we can, and you've seen this discussed endlessly this year, we can launch D-Day and bring about the liberation of occupied Europe. They did other things at Bletchley besides Enigma. We had different enemy nations, remember? Japan and Italy were major nations. They had their own coding and cipher systems. And this is not a complete list. It gives you some idea of the variety of the work that was tackled at Bletchley Park. And that is a little booklet that if you haven't remembered everything I've said this evening, or you want to take something for a friend who said they might be able to come but they couldn't come, or you can take that and read it up and bamboozle your friends with it. So for a mere £3, you can get an account of Enigma Machine, Bletchley Park, and the Battle of the Atlantic. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the chairman has been kind of waving at me, meaning 5 fingers. I hope I didn't run over too long. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is the way I see the Enigma machine. And you're very welcome to come and have a look at the books, and certainly to come and operate the machine. And I would certainly encourage you, because you may never, unless you come to another of my presentations, you may never get another chance to handle a genuine Second World War German Enigma machine. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. A terrific presentation. And you're happy to take a few questions?
Yes.
Could I sort of prime the pump? The interesting thing I thought was that the very first image you showed on the advertisement actually had 4 rotors.
Well spotted.
This one has 3. This one has 3.
Yes, it's not. The 4th rotor in that image, it hasn't got a plug board, notice. You might notice that. It hasn't got a plug board. It's got 4 rotors, but the 4th rotor, the one on the immediate left, is actually the reflector rotor. It's a turnable reflector rotor. So it does not have that. The early machine, which was the commercial version, does not have the power that the 4-rotor machine used by the U-boats, because that had 4 rotors and the reflector rotor. So it is a more complicated machine, but well spotted.
Second question, if I may. How did they handle a normal typewriter has numbers?
True.
No numbers here.
I know.
How did they handle
It's a pain. They had to spell them out.
They had to spell them out?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Which is a great pain. There was at one point, some of the machines, if you look at them, none of them have numbers on, but they don't have separate keys. Some of them, and I don't quite know which departments had them, but it's a minority. The top row, the keys had they weren't split in half, but the label was split in half, and it goes Q, W, E, R, T, Z, U, I, O. And it was split in half, and Q had a 1 on as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Bad luck, because the 9 falls on the 0. So the 0 had to go down with a P. Now, you can still only press the key. But what the Germans did to use those and shorten the messages was to put 2 Y's in, because Y is a very, very rare letter in German. Very rare indeed. My German dictionary's only got 4 words which begin with Y. And they're all foreign imports. It's a very rare letter indeed. Indeed, who plays Scrabble? Any Scrabble players? Right. If you get an English Scrabble set, you get 10 for a Z and 4 for a Y. If you go to Germany and buy a Scrabble set, you get 10 for the Y and only 4 for the Z. And you may not have stopped to think that, but different countries have different scores and different numbers of tiles. They're all playing the same game, but it's using local vocabulary. So Y is very rare, and what the sender could do is to put 2 Ys. Where Y is rare, double Y is unknown in German. So if they put 2 Ys, it meant read the next series of keys as if they were the numbers on the top rather than the letters, until you get to another 2 Ys, which means you go back to letters. So it's a toggle, an operating toggle, if you like. Double Y means read everything as numbers, and that means you get away. You've got to add 4 letters in it, obviously because you've got 2 Ys at each end of the message. But instead of doing, say, Fünfundzwanzig for 25, which is 7, it's about 18 letters or something. No, not quite, 15 letters. Instead of typing in 15 letters, you just type 2 and a 5. Well, YY, effectively 2, 5, YY. So it shortens the messages. And that's quite important, because even though the Germans did not believe we were reading these messages, they knew damn well we could listen to them. And if you're a U-boat on the surface sending a long message, somebody's going to pick you up on direction finding, and they're going to come steaming down that beam and start depth charging you. So it was important for everybody, senders and receivers, to keep the messages as short as possible. But they didn't all have that thing. But mostly they had to spell it out. Right. Spell the numbers out. Yeah, sorry.
Could I have an indication as to who would like to... any other questions? Yes, please. Could you ask your question?
Did the British have an equivalent?
Sort of. We did have a rotor cipher machine. The important thing is that we didn't use any one method or system as across the board in the way the Germans used this, because they thought this was good. Everybody had it. As I say, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Secret Police, the Railways, the Post Office, they all had it. All had it. Different variations, but basically the same machine. We did not use our machine, which was called Typex. We didn't use it in as across the board way as the Germans did. They had something like 30,000+ Enigma machines. We had about 10,000 Typex machines. And one was captured, one was left behind on the beach at Dunkirk. And when the Germans captured it, there were no rotors in. The rotors, of course, are the key to this whole thing. To make the thing as secure as possible, if you take the rotors out, if you leave it behind, then whoever captures it has got not much of a prize. So the Germans captured this Typex machine, and they said, oh, look, the British have got a rotor cipher machine. Now, they could have said, hang on, if the British have got a rotor cipher machine which is as sophisticated as an Enigma, then perhaps the British would be able to break Enigma because they'll know enough about these sort of cipher machines, how they work. They didn't go down that road. The route they went down was to say, the British have got a rotor cipher machine, which is, pretty well the same as Enigma, and Enigma's unbreakable. So there's no point in trying to break Enigma, Typex messages, because they will not be breakable. Mm-hmm. So they had a sort of clue there, but they they ended up going in the wrong direction there. We did, amongst other things, we rewired every single Typex rotor every 6 months because we knew the vulnerability of this kind of system. Whereas the rotors that were in the German Air Force and Army machine, they were fixed in 1938 and weren't changed at all right to the end of the war. And the Poles worked out what the wiring was, and so we knew it right from the start. The Germans did not take advantage of this sort of huge number of possibilities to the full extent.
Okay. Happy with the response? Yes? There was a lady at the back who held her hand up. No? A gentleman in the... Oh, yes, please.
Short question. Thank you for your talk, by the way. Why was it called Enigma?
It's just, there was a quite a fashion in the late Victorian period, early 20th century.
Mark, if you could come here and project
yes,
we can all hear you.
There was quite a fashion.
Did everyone hear the question? Yes. Why was it called Enigma?
Quite a fashion in the late Victorian period and the early 20th century, giving products Latin or Greek names, because any intelligent, any educated person in any country would know what that meant. And there's quite a lot, things like Vim, for instance, Vim, aquascutum, I mean, there's quite a lot you can think up. And Enigma is just a Greek word meaning puzzle. So it was a good name to give a sophisticated thing, because anyone educated in any country would recognize the name.
Okay, fine. Yes, please.
Are any Enigma machines do they suddenly come to light?
Yes?
Sorry, do
any Enigma machines come to light? Yes, they do.
Okay.
There's a classic case about 5 years ago where in a flea market in Romania, there was an Enigma machine for sale for €100. It was spotted by a professor of mathematics who bought it for the €100. I don't know whether he argued about the price, and sold it almost immediately for €47,000. And the last time I saw it, it looked as though it hadn't been, sorry, I only saw it on screen, as it were. It didn't look as though it had been repaired or tinkered with in any way. It was for sale in the States for about $220,000.
Wow.
So, keep your eyes open.
Yeah, please.
I wasn't quite sure, when you get the encrypted message and you key it into the machine, and out comes plain text, I'm not quite sure why that is the case. Why you don't just get
Did people hear the question?
Yes. Why, when you type the cipher text in, does it not just get jumbled again? Because if you can put your mind back to the picture I showed you, the close-up of the scrambler unit, close-up. We've got the three rotors, we've got the reflector rotor on the left and the entry rotor on the right. When the current comes in, there's only 26 points that it can come in the entry rotor, labelled effectively A to Z. It's got to come in and go out of those, and I stressed that when the current goes from left to right and then out through the entry rotor, it's got to go on a different route. So it might come in at A, zigzag through the rotors, turn around by the reflector rotor and go out through, let's say, G. So it's coming at A and G. Now that means at that moment, A and G are uniquely connected together. If something comes in A, it goes out G, but if it were to come in G, it would go out of A. And what the receiver is doing is effectively typing in the G, which will be the cipher version of A, and he's sending a current through into the J terminal, and it comes out of A, so it lights up his A bulb. It's designed to act reciprocally, and it's because it's a single-sided scrambler with only 26 points of entry. If something comes in the A terminal and goes out the G terminal, if you send the current the other direction, the receiver's sending it the other direction, it goes in the G terminal and comes out the A. Is that okay?
Sorry, a moment, Michael. Lady at the back.
You said Y is very rare in German.
It is.
German, but is that why the Y is where it is on the keyboard there?
It is partly, yes. Yes, it is partly. But what I think this is an idea which I've never seen anyone else either put forward or argue or confute. If you think of the history of the machine, when Arthur Shirbage's company is putting it on the market, he's not selling to typists and secretaries. He's selling to hard-nosed office managers. Now, they are likely to be more attracted to a machine which looks like a typewriter, because he knows all the girls in the typing pool are using typewriters. So it's some sense in arranging the keys in typewriter format. That's the first half of the question. The other half is that why are they in that way? Why is a QWERTY, which we have a QWERTY key, why is it QWERTY? Why is it arranged like that? Do you remember, you probably aren't old enough, but Brian and I probably do, typewriters, whether they were portable or not, when you type the key, an arm came forward with a negative impression of a letter on, and it hit a carbon ribbon or a tape soaked in ink, and it banged a letter onto a piece of paper and it came back again. Now, as it's coming back, if you're typing fast enough, the next letter is coming forward, and they clash. And what you do when you type it, you just flick them and on you go. I mean, you're always doing that. But they were arranged. The choice had been made in late Victorian, yes, I think it was Victorian times, I think it was before 1900, to arrange the keys on the keyboard to minimise the clashing on a manual typewriter with these arms that come backwards and forwards. So that's why we have letters arranged not alphabetically. And because in German, Y and Z have sort of are the opposite values to the or frequency they do in English, that's why you get a QWERTY keyboard, which is the standard German keyboard. It's got a Z there, because Z is far more common in German than in English. Y is a pretty common letter in English at the end of words. We don't have all that many beginning, but all those adjectives, so many adjectives and adverbs end in a Y. But as I say, Z is quite rare in English, and Y is much more common, vice versa in German.
Michael, you had a question.
Yeah, well, I was just making the comment that a guy in a U-boat has one shot in real time to read the message. Am I right?
Did people hear the
Well,
question?
not really.
No, in the gentleman in the U-boat, the question was, gentleman in the U-boat has one shot to read the message.
Well, I mean, there will be a message will be sent to him, and he will. In fact, in the U-boat, you don't have three guys like you do with Guderian. You have one man. He works the radio, he listens to incoming messages, he operates the Enigma machine, and he's also the DJ, because he's got the record turntable. When the commander of the U-boat says we can play some music through the ship to cheer people up, he can play that as well. Now, he will, if a radio message comes in, he's got to write it down. And of course, it's a long string of letters, and he has to decrypt it. Now, if he can't decrypt it, if something's gone wrong, he just has to radio back and say, didn't get it, send it again. And of course, that was a pain for everybody. Yeah. But if for whatever reason, through corruption or mistake or whatever, you couldn't get the message, there's no point saying, I didn't understand the message, because it might be very important. You've got to ask for it again. So he has one shot at listening to it, but he can get it repeated. And then he's got it written down, and provided he's got it written down, he can have more than one shot at decrypting it.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
Yes, please.
The little book that they had to say what the settings for the rotors were, I'm just trying to work out the logistics of getting that information to every...
Difficult, yeah. It's called what's called key distribution problem. Very difficult, yes.
The U-boats particularly.
Yes, the U-boats. If the U-boats were going on out on station for more than a certain number of weeks at a time, or indeed the surface vessels, they would take next month's book as well. And we didn't usually, people often say to me, why didn't we just go and capture the red books? Well, the answer is there's about 300 or 400 per year, and we couldn't guarantee to capture them all. And if you want to capture them, you want to capture them somewhere in the first few days of the month, not at the end of the month. And we couldn't arrange that. And so Alan Turing invents that bomb in order to give the code breakers a chance of breaking the messages without having to get the red code book. But on two occasions, we deliberately set out to capture code books because we noticed that the weather ships, German had sort of armed trawlers, which they used as weather ships. They sent them out into, pretty well somewhere south of sort of Greenland, Iceland, into the middle of the Atlantic, because, as you know, the weather in the Atlantic forms much of the weather we get in Europe, and the Luftwaffe wanted early weather reports. So out went the weather ships, and we noticed that they were on station for more than a month at a time. Therefore, they must have, and they used Enigma, they must have more than 1 month's code books. So we deliberately attacked two of them, the München and the Lauenburg, on different occasions. We sent, it must have been a very uneven battle, because they only got about 10 men on these things, armed with a couple of rifles and things, perhaps one anti-aircraft gun, that kind of thing. They're only modest little ships. Sent 4 destroyers steaming down, and the guys, break out the guns. They said, hang on, we're not going to see off 4 destroyers. Get the Enigma machine, throw it overboard, clear everything off the wireless man's table, clear it over the board, captain's table, everything overboard, jump in the dinghy and raise the white flag, and we'll surrender. And they did that, and were taken on board, put down below so they couldn't see what was happening. And what had been predicted was that in the excitement, the panic, nobody would have thought that in the captain's safe is next month's book. So we boarded the ships, broke open into the safe, took out next month's things, went back to the British destroyers, and then sunk the weather ship by gunfire. And all we reported was Lauenburg attacked and sunk by gunfire, crew taken off, but not that it had been boarded.
Very good.
But that was there were only about twice that we actually set out to do that.
Right. Do we have any more questions? Well, I think we should, it's been a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. I think we should draw to a close now and just thank our speaker once more.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.